key pillar that upholds the US empire is the petrodollar. This system, inbuilt since the 70s, has maintained US global hegemony through the dollar. We're going to be explaining today how this has operated and how this has helped establish the US empire and global American imperialism. And then we'll be breaking down how the recent events that have taken place in the Middle East are threatening to destabilize this and how we're moving to a more multipolar world. Now, I'll let you get going, Muslim bro. You are the one who is more of an expert on this stuff than me. So please, take it away.
Amazing. Now, what is the petrodollar agreement itself? Well, the petrodollar agreement is an overarching kind of explanation of Saudi and US relations over agreeing that Saudi Arabia was going to sell its petrol in USD. And then started encompassing other countries around, right? Saudi Arabia first with the Middle East, and then other countries such as Libya, Algeria, Ecuador, Venezuela, etc., etc. These are the OPEC countries. Okay, so if anyone ever mentions OPEC countries, these are the countries that you can see on the graph. They're being represented. Now, the significance of this is in the fact that roughly 80%, 80% of these countries, which are responsible for around 60 to 70% of oil exports, are selling their oil in dollars. Now, if you know anything about trading commodities in the world, you know that if you were to buy gold, you'd have to buy in dollars. If you were to buy petrol, you'd have to buy in dollars. If you were to buy copper, nickel, etc., in most cases, you'd buy in dollars. But what is fundamental to every single modern economy? Petrol, right? Crude oil. And so what this ends up doing is that every single economy has to rely on petrodollars. It has to rely on petrol and therefore the dollar. Now, again, the significance of this is in the fact that every single country has to buy dollar before it buys petrol. And to buy dollars, it's not as simple as let me trade my dollars for pounds or let me trade my dollars for euros, but you also then have to hold dollar-denominated assets that the US government owns. Now, there's going to be more on this a little bit later, but this is just to establish the point that these are the countries that sell, well, 80% of these countries sell their petrol in dollar. And all of this is to create a very strong kind of backing of US dollar, like constant flow of US dollar around the world. I don't know the exact number, Christian bro, I don't know if you know it either. We can probably look it up later on, but you can imagine the trillions and trillions of dollars that get circulated every single day simply in trading petrol. Not in any other market, by the way, which the US dollar is also the most powerful currency in, but specifically petrol. Now, again, what's so important about this? Why does this actually matter? Well, why this matters is because it allows a certain amount of leeway. When I say certain amount, I mean an insane amount of leeway for the US to do what it wants. Because fundamentally, it has control of its currency. And seeing as so much of its currency is circulated around, it means it can do one of two things. Number one, it can buy dollars off of other people. Well, again, why is that significant? Well, because if you think about it this way, seeing as the federal government is allowed, or I should say the central bank, is allowed to print out as much dollars as it wants, simply by printing out more dollars, it can decrease the interest rate on dollars. And therefore, if the US is in debt, it can sell off its debt, or pay off its debt, I should say, very cheaply. Why? Because the interest rate is down. However, if it wants to make money from the US dollars that are circulating around the economy, all it has to do is print less US dollar and therefore have less in circulation. And now, if it decides to borrow, it can borrow at higher interest rate, which means it makes more money. Okay. Now, this is why you see the US debt rising consistently, year after year after year. And you might see the exponential growth from 2010 onwards as well. And that's primarily from the fact that Iraq got booted, right? Which kind of scared the other OPEC countries into doing anything against the US and threatening the petrodollar. Now, the significance of this is if you look on the right-hand side, the world military expenditure, okay, you can see that the US spends $880 billion, which there's a very famous statistic that the US spends more than the top 5 countries or something like that in its military expenditure. And again, I used to always ask myself, like, how? Like, surely they're just not that rich. Well, it's not about wealth necessarily. It's not about this is how many assets the US holds in total, and this is how much they can invest from their assets into their military. Again, it's the fact that they can borrow cheaply and sell at any rate they want. And therefore, if they are indebted, they can just sell their debt and borrow more continuously without the normal repercussions of this happening. Now, the normal repercussions of this happening, I think you can probably add a point here, Christian bro, you've studied a decent amount of economics as well. But any country that would borrow more than it can pay back would have to default, right? And it'd basically go bankrupt and it'd have to decrease its expenditure because the money doesn't exist anymore. But the US can effectively just print more money to either take itself out of debt or make sure it can borrow more at a favorable rate. Plus, again, who does the US borrow from? Well, it borrows from the countries that already hold dollar-denominated assets. And so it's this reflexive cycle of, I'm the US, for example, right? I want to pay off my debts cheaply. Okay, let me print out more money. Let me have more money. Therefore, everybody else's US dollars now go down in value slightly in terms of the interest rate. Okay, cool. Now let me pay off my debts because I have to technically pay less on those debts. Okay, I want to get more money circulating and I want people to start purchasing more US dollars. Let me decrease the amount that's in circulation to increase its value and let me get more countries to buy it. Again, countries constantly have to buy US dollar. This is why it's in constant circulation as well. This is why it's a system that can be easily abused because they have to buy petrol. So the US maintains this hegemony. You might be thinking, why don't they just sell their petrol in other currencies, right? Surely they're very more favorable rates. It's not like the US dollar is a two-way street of like, what's the word? It's not like everybody's happy with it, right? Like, it's not like the amount of money that the countries that sell their petrol in dollars are always happy, right? They could potentially make more money. They could have higher profits if they sold them in euros and then went in exchange these euros for yuan and then they sold it to et cetera, et cetera. Yes. But then you risk America invading you. Very simple. That's it. See what happened to Libya, for example. Right? It's not fully due to the petrodollar, but primarily we can argue it was. See what happened in Iraq. Okay? If you're watching this and you still think Iraq was some like holy crusade against terrorism or against dictators, just wake up, right? Hopefully this, I don't know why you'd be watching this channel in the first place, but you realize hopefully that it had nothing to do with that. And it primarily had to do with the fact that Saddam Hussein wanted to sell his oil in euros. And we'll talk about a little bit more of the consequences later on, but we're not going to talk about the euro as a potential threat. We're going to talk about two other threats, which Christian Bro is going to be very excited to talk about. But the last point I want to make here is the fact that this creates an interconnected relationship between every single country and national economy in the world. The other day in university, I had a friend come up to me, and he knows I'm a petrodollar expert. Obviously, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the means. All of this stuff I've learned from way more intelligent people or reading books such as John Perkins' book. But he asked me, he was like, why can't our government spend more on welfare? And I gave him the national argument, why the government can't spend more money because, well, the UK's fiscal situation isn't the best. But I also told him, well, if you want to look at it this way as well, the UK can't really do what it wants in terms of its international spending either, right? And I specifically gave him the example of how many US debt that we hold and US denominated assets and US treasury bonds, which effectively means that our economy is very heavily linked to the dollar and what the US decides to do with its currency. And so I made a joke, and although I'm half joking, that economically, the UK is kind of just a vassal state of the US because of how much dollars it holds, how much US treasury bonds. In fact, most central banks in the UK have to hold, I believe it's 20% of US dollars constantly to be allowed to do certain trades, to be allowed to make certain moves. So a UK bank is still somewhat dependent on the US, even though it's a UK bank. Now, the interconnectedness is important in the fact that if Japan, for example, decided to sell its US treasury bonds or decided to start selling its debt, what this would mean is that China would now not want to keep its US dollars, or it would decide to buy more to maintain the stability. The fact that this Jenga tower has random support networks means that it's very difficult to collapse it. You'd have to have almost every single country on that table that you see in the left, or at least half, maybe we'd say, a big enough just a big enough group to create a domino effect of people selling off their dollars for it to actually be threatened. Which is why what Christian Bro is going to start talking about now is so significant. Seeing as everyone's interconnected, everyone's kind of trapped by the fact that they keep buying more US dollars. And so there's kind of no way out, really. Well, there is, but it's a very difficult way out. It's very painful. And we'd have to go through almost 20, some experts say even 50 years of economic collapse to then be able to recover in the long term and have a different currency become a hegemon, or a different currency at least be a bit more balanced in that regard. Do you want to add anything here, Christian, bro, before we move on to your points?
I will clarify one other thing quickly just to explain quickly why oil producing nations are also so willing to buy US Treasury debts. There is a certain balance of payment ratios that comes into oil exports. Essentially, the value of your oil exports has to be offset by some kind of spending, be that purchasing of goods or whatever. However, the most common and effective way for these people to do that offset is to just buy US Treasury. That's also part of the reason they're buying the stocks. But that's all I wanted to add. I think you've comprehensively covered what you wanted to do there, and quite impressively. I'd have a glass of water if I were you.
Yeah, I just took a sip now. But no, that's a very good point. Very, very good point. Just emphasizes the point that US dollar is in constant circulation. There's no way around it. So,
but yes, how is this actually declining now that there's the big Middle East catastrophe? Well, I'm not going to be breaking any news to anyone by stating that oil has been shut off from the Strait of Hormuz, and the situation could actually even get worse. As you see here, the Bab el Mandeb, which is between Yemen and Djibouti, could also be shut off because Iranian proxies under the Houthis are also operating within this region. So we do have now two potential choke points to this. Now, most of the global oil comes out of the Middle East, and Iran has now essentially put a blockade on this coming out, meaning that no longer can these exports be essentially traded anymore. The other big thing more, though, however, is that the Iran conflict has basically undermined US stability. Part of what's underpinning the petrodollar system is this kind of guarantee of American hegemony. If American hegemony is seen to be waning, which it clearly is right now, it's been 5 weeks, and besides any kind of nuclear intervention, I do not see America getting anything out of this conflict now. Their hegemony has been undermined. They are no longer the one able to guarantee the outflow of treasury security. Now, this can also undermine it because it now allows China to start implementing their own system of the petro yuan. Now, already Russia and Iran sell to China, Russia and Iran being two of the largest exporters of oil anyway. They are cut off from the US system, so they can't purchase treasury to offset their export balances. So they sell to China at a kind of discounted rate to accumulate goods in kind as return. Now, with China now becoming far more secure as a backer than the US to a lot of oil producing countries, countries will probably start selling in yuan a lot more. They'll start shifting away from dollar purchases and maybe even start purchasing in yuan, basically undermining the system that is the petrodollar. China has the tools to do this. China has the military prowess, and China has not had dented prestige like the USA. China now can move in and start decentralizing this. Now, there won't be like an immediate collapse of the petrodollar system. It would more be a long, gradual kind of undermining of it. You won't ever truly see the dollar leave the global currency trading system. It would just be more, instead of being the currency that's 80% traded with, it would probably decline to around 50% as the yuan and the euro make up more the percentages in this table. In the short term as well, it won't lead to the collapse, primarily because actually spikes like this in oil prices do tend to strengthen the dollar. So the point is more that there's the prestige of the US that is lost. It's not necessarily the value of it, it's the prestige itself and the guarantee behind it. So if the UAE starts trading in yuan, for example, over the fact that America has failed to protect them, you see the share of the currencies being traded become more unmonopolized and turned into one. Another big way this can happen is through Russia. Now, Russia wants, inevitably, I mean, this war has been going on now for quite a long time, but eventually this war with Russia and Ukraine will end, and Russia will be able to resume selling oil to the European market. Now, Russia is not a dumb state, and I'm sure once they are able to start selling again, they're going to know that they shouldn't be selling in dollar anymore. Pre-2022, the Russians did sell in dollar. However, obviously with the sanctions cutting that off, they will probably, if they do sell to Europe, demand euro. So they're not cut off from so they don't have the same consequences that occurred in 2022 again. So now we can see one of the largest energy markets, Europe, transfer to euro, away from the dollar in their energy purchases. So you'll see not this total collapse of the petrodollar system, but the loss of its monopolizing effect, as oil essentially becomes traded not just in the dollar, but in the yuan, in the euro, and any other currency that emerges.
Amazing points. If this war highlights anything, I wanted to add as well, Christian, bro, is that we have to remind ourselves the reason these countries decided to partner up with the US it's for their own personal and political interests as well. Saudi Arabia, for example, expected the US to protect its power and its state from any insurgency, whether that be internal. Not whether that be internal, but an internal insurgency of some kind. And so that's also a reason why the Saudi, for example, government doesn't have a huge military force, because they rely on an American base. They rely on American soldiers. If in the worst case scenario they had some sort of uprising or potential civil war, that would be handled. Or if in the case of Iran attacking them, they'd expect to be defended, but they haven't. And so this agreement that was made in the 70s, we could see with Nixon and Henry Kissinger in the back, probably giggling to himself. What ended up happening is that this war has highlighted the fact that you cannot just rely on the US anymore. The petrodollar system is beneficial to the US and to the country that gets protected by the US. And I'm specifically talking about the Middle East here, right? In all the Middle Eastern countries. And so unless China can not just start maybe producing an incentive to trade in the yuan, but also producing an incentive of power, of a political incentive for these OPEC countries, then like Christian Bro said, we probably won't see a dip between, I think 50% is very optimistic, Christian Bro, even 60, 65, 70%, probably won't see a dip below that for, the petrodollar, for the US dollar being traded for oil. Unless, like I said, political motives can be satisfied. Because remember, economy is downstream of power. It's downstream of politics. So it's not just an economic incentive. This is always incentivized by power, first and foremost.
Very much. And also to that point as well, it does have to be stated as well, the yuan is not as liquidized as the dollar, right? So there is also that preserving the dollar's regulation. And of course, it's not just oil that maintains, US dollar hegemony. There is a lot of other goods and services traded. But in terms of petrol, let's also not forget China is the largest importer of it. And therefore, they will also be the ones mainly dealing in the transactions with the oil producing states. So despite it maybe not dipping ridiculously low, the yuan is sure from this conflict to emerge as a bit more of a larger share of the petrol trading currency value.
Absolutely. Yeah. On an ending point before we summarize, I was going to say very quickly, there's a very famous quote in real estate, which is that if you consume so much money from the bank, as in you keep taking out loans from the bank, you basically own the bank. While China's in that kind of unique situation. They consume so much petrol, they kind of control the petrol market slightly. And so we'll just have to see what they decide to do with that quote-unquote ownership of that. But anyway, let's get your world famous summaries, Christian Bro, and then we'll end the video there.
Yeah, just to summarize, the US empire has been built upon the petrodollar, which states are willing to pay in treasuries and uphold to offset their balance of export payments. States buy into the petrodollar system because they buy into US prestige being eternal. However, the conflict in the Middle East has shown that US power can be dented, and the US empire is in decline to more serious empires like China. With Russia being able to sell to Europe and China dictating the oil flows, there will be more of a dilution of the currencies used to buy oil, diversifying the amount of currency in there and thus weakening the position of the dollar in the petrodollar trading system. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you guys soon.
God bless, and take care of yourselves, guys. Again, would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Same as usual, feel free to let us know, and we'll respond to the good ones. You're all smart anyway. Anyway, take care. Bye-bye.